Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
My husband secretly transferred our house to his mother while I was in the hospital. When I came back, my mother-in-law said, "You don't live here anymore." She threw my belongings out the door. I quietly left, but they had no idea that the house was actually— Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I never thought I would be the kind of woman who got pushed out of her own home. But life has a way of teaching you lessons you never signed up for, in classrooms you never chose. My name is Margaret Calloway. Most people who love me call me Peggy. I am 68 years old, and I have lived in the same white clapboard house on Birchwood Lane in Cloverdale, Ohio, for 31 years. My late husband, Robert, and I bought it together in the spring of 1993, when the paint was peeling and the porch sagged, and we didn't care one bit because it was ours. We raised our daughter, Claire, in that house. We buried Robert's old dog in the backyard under the oak tree. I planted roses along the south fence that still bloom every June without being asked. Robert passed 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. It took him fast, the way it always does, and it left me with a grief so large I had to learn to walk around it every morning, like a piece of furniture in a dark room. But I had my house, my garden, my neighbors, my routines. I had Claire. And when Claire married Derek Holt 4 years ago, I told myself I was gaining a son. I was wrong about that. But I didn't know it yet. Derek was charming in the way that certain men are charming. Smoothly, effortlessly, and always in service of something. He had a wide smile and a firm handshake, and he called me Mom from the very first Christmas. At the time, it warmed me. Looking back, I understand it was a measurement. He was figuring out how close he could get. The first real warning sign came about 18 months into their marriage. Derek suggested, casually, over dinner, as if the thought had just occurred to him, that it was a lot of house for one woman. He said it with concern in his voice. He said Claire worried about me being alone. He said property taxes were only going up. I smiled and changed the subject. But I felt something shift. The way you feel a cold draft before you find the open window. After that, I started noticing things. Derek began asking questions about Robert's estate. Not intrusive questions, just curious ones, he said. He asked once whether I had a will. He asked whether Robert had left everything in order. He asked, almost as an aside, whether the house was in my name alone or whether there was anything complicated about the title. I told him the house was mine. I didn't tell him everything. Then, in January of last year, I had a health scare. My heart. Nothing catastrophic, but serious enough that I was admitted to St. Catherine's Medical Center for 11 days. Claire was there every day. Derek visited twice. He brought flowers the second time, which I thought was kind. The nurses complimented him. He shook hands with my cardiologist. I should have been paying more attention to what he was doing when he wasn't at the hospital. When I was discharged, Claire drove me home. It was a Tuesday, cold and gray, with the kind of February sky that makes everything look provisional. As we pulled into the driveway on Birchwood Lane, I noticed Sandra Holt's silver Buick parked in front of the house. I thought that was odd. I thought perhaps she had come to welcome me home. I walked up my own porch steps, holding the railing the way the doctors had told me to. I had my overnight bag. I was tired. The roses along the south fence were brown and sleeping, waiting for spring. Sandra opened the front door before I could reach it. She was a tall woman, Sandra. Late 60s, iron gray hair, a face that wore its expressions like stage makeup, exaggerated and unconvincing. She stood in my doorway with her arms crossed, and she looked at me the way you look at a stranger who has wandered onto your property. "Peggy," she said. Not a greeting, more like a statement of a problem. I stopped on the top step. "Sandra, what are you doing here?" She tilted her head slightly, as if my confusion amused her. "This is my house now," she said. "Derek transferred the deed while you were in the hospital. I think it's better if you make other arrangements." I looked at Claire. Claire looked at the ground. Behind Sandra, through the open door, I could see my own living room, my furniture, my photographs on the wall, my life, still sitting there, as if nothing had happened. There were 2 boxes on the porch. My winter coat was folded on top of one of them. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I picked up my overnight bag, looked at Sandra once more, and I walked back down those steps. But I want to tell you something. As I walked away from my own house on that gray February morning, I was not defeated. I was thinking. I spent that first night at my neighbor Helen's house. Helen Pruitt, 71 years old, a retired school teacher who made strong coffee and didn't ask too many questions until you were ready to answer them. I sat at her kitchen table while she put a bowl of soup in front of me, and I stared at the yellow wallpaper and tried to understand what had just happened to my life. What had happened was this. My son-in-law had waited until I was sedated in a cardiac unit, had forged or manipulated documents related to my property, and had transferred my home, Robert's home, our home, to his mother. And my daughter, my own Claire, had known. Or had looked at the ground, which is the same thing. I want to be honest about the fear, because it was real. I was 68 years old, recovering from a cardiac event. With 2 boxes of my belongings on a porch I was no longer allowed to enter. My income was Social Security and the modest interest from Robert's life insurance policy. I had no mortgage because the house had been paid off for 9 years, and now that asset, the only significant asset I had been stolen from me in 11 days. What does a woman do with that kind of fear? I let myself feel it for exactly 1 night. I lay on Helen's guest room bed, in the dark, and I let the fear move through me like weather. I thought about Robert and how he had always said that a frightened person makes bad decisions, and a grieving person makes worse ones. He had been a careful man, Robert, a planner. He had trusted lawyers and paperwork and the quiet architecture of legal protection. And that was when I remembered. In 2018, 2 years before Robert died, his attorney, a quiet, thorough man named Gerald Fitch, had helped us restructure our estate. We had put the house into a revocable living trust, the Calloway Family Trust. Robert was the original trustee. When he died, trusteeship passed to me. The house was held in the name of the trust, not in my personal name. I sat up in Helen's guest room at 2:30 in the morning. Derek had tried to transfer the deed of a house that, legally, he had no authority to transfer. Because the deed wasn't in my name. It was in the name of a trust. And you cannot forge a trust document the way you might forge a quitclaim deed, because a trust has a history. A paper trail of filings, tax records, a registered attorney, a bank account. A trust has weight. The question was, what exactly had Derek filed? How had he done it? And was there any court in Ohio that would recognize it? The next morning, I asked Helen if I could borrow her car. I had 3 things to do. First, I was going to the county recorder's office to pull the current deed records on 14 Birchwood Lane. Second, I was going to call Gerald Fitch. Third, and this one required some steadiness, I was going to call my daughter. I dressed carefully that morning. I put on my good wool coat and my low-heeled boots, and I did my hair, because Robert always said that the way you present yourself tells other people how seriously to take you. I was not going to be a disheveled old woman in a hospital bracelet. I was going to be Margaret Calloway, and I was going to be taken seriously. Helen drove me to the courthouse. She waited in the car with a paperback novel and didn't ask where I was going because she already knew I would tell her when I was ready. The recorder's office was on the 2nd floor of the Maddox County Courthouse. A beige room with fluorescent lighting and a woman behind the counter named Donna, who had kind eyes and a government employee's particular brand of efficient sympathy. I gave her the address. I asked for the current deed history. She printed it out and slid it across the counter. I read it standing there under the fluorescent lights, and I felt something cold and focused settle in my chest. Derek had filed a quit-claim deed on January 19th, 8 days after I was admitted to St. Catherine's. The grantor listed was Margaret R. Calloway. The grantee was Sandra L. Holt. A notary stamp appeared at the bottom. My signature was on that document. I had not signed that document. I folded the paper precisely, put it in my purse, thanked Donna, and walked back to the elevator. I did not allow myself to feel anything in that beige room because I needed to save it. In the parking lot, I sat in the passenger seat of Helen's car and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is a rare and valuable quality in a person. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Peggy, that is forgery." "Yes," I said, "it is." "What are you going to do?" I looked out the window at the courthouse steps, at the ordinary people going in and out with their ordinary problems. "I'm going to call Gerald Fitch," I said, "and then I'm going to let Derek find out what a trust document actually means." Gerald Fitch had not changed much in 4 years. He was a small, neat man in his early 70s, with reading glasses that he wore pushed up on his forehead until he actually needed them, and a habit of writing everything down on a yellow legal pad in handwriting so precise it looked typeset. His office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building on Commerce Street, and it smelled of old paper and wood polish, and something that reminded me of Robert. I had called him from Helen's kitchen that same morning, and he had told me to come at 2 o'clock. I arrived at 5 minutes to 2. I laid everything on his desk in order: the printed deed record from the recorder's office, the copy of our original trust documents that I had kept in a fireproof lockbox in Helen's basement. I had brought the lockbox with me when I left Birchwood Lane, which turned out to be one of the few good decisions I made that day. And my hospital discharge paperwork, which established precisely where I had been on January 19th, when my signature supposedly appeared on a notarized quitclaim deed. Gerald read everything slowly. He pushed his glasses down to his nose for the deed record. He pushed them back up for the trust document. He wrote things on his legal pad. He did not say anything for a long time, and I had learned enough about Gerald Fitch to know that this was a good sign. Anxious lawyers talk too much. Finally, he set down his pen. "Peggy," he said, "this deed is void." I had believed this, but hearing it said aloud by a man like Gerald Fitch was a different thing entirely. Something loosened in my chest. "Explain it to me," I said. "Explain it the way you'd explain it to a judge." He nodded. "The property at 14 Birchwood Lane has been held in the Calloway Family Trust since October 2018. The trust is the legal owner of the property, not you personally. A quitclaim deed transferring property from Margaret R. Calloway to Sandra Holt is meaningless because Margaret R. Calloway, as an individual, has no title to convey. The grantor on this deed has no standing. It's like trying to sell someone a car you don't own. And the forgery?" He tapped the document with one finger. "That is a separate matter and a serious one. Your signature has been notarized on a document you did not sign, on a date when you were admitted to a cardiac unit. That is forgery of a legal document, which in Ohio is a felony. It also potentially implicates the notary, depending on how this was arranged." I thought about that. I thought about Derek's wide smile and his firm handshake, and the way he had said Mom at Christmas. "What do I do first?" I asked. "First," Gerald said, "we file a quiet title action to formally establish the trust's ownership and have the fraudulent deed stricken from the public record. That puts the legal situation beyond dispute. Second, we refer the forgery to the county prosecutor's office. That is not something I can handle. That is criminal, not civil, but I can help you prepare what they'll need." He paused. "And Peggy, do you want me to notify Derek's attorney if he has one?" "Not yet," I said. Gerald allowed himself a small, careful smile. "All right." I left his office at 3:30 with a folder of copied documents and a court filing scheduled for the following Monday. Walking back to Helen's borrowed car, I noticed that the February air felt different than it had that morning. Less heavy. I don't know how else to describe it. What I didn't know yet was that Derek had already begun to feel something was wrong. He called Claire that same evening. I learned this later, and asked whether I had said anything, whether I had made trouble. Claire told him I had gone to stay with Helen. Derek was quiet for a moment. Then, according to Claire, he said, "She doesn't understand how this works. She'll calm down." He was already wrong, but he didn't know it. Sandra, for her part, had wasted no time. By the time I left Gerald's office, she had already engaged a locksmith to change the locks on Birchwood Lane. She had arranged for her furniture, a dark sectional sofa and a glass coffee table I found hideous, to be stored in the garage, ready to move in. She had told the neighbors, with characteristic nerve, that she had inherited the house from a family situation that was complicated. She had even put a pot of artificial flowers on my porch. When Helen drove me past the house that evening, I asked her to because I needed to see it. I looked at those plastic flowers in the February cold, and I felt, very briefly, a white-hot anger that I had to breathe through carefully, the way you breathe through pain. Then I looked away. I had a quiet title filing. I had a forged deed with a hospital discharge record that made it impossible. I had Gerald Fitch on my side, and Gerald Fitch had been doing this for 40 years. Did Derek really think a pot of plastic flowers was going to be the last word? The quiet title action was filed on Monday, February 24th, at 9:47 in the morning. Gerald's paralegal, a young woman named Tess, who wore her hair in a braid and moved through the courthouse with the confidence of someone who had filed 1,000 documents and would file 1,000 more, handled the paperwork while Gerald and I waited in the lobby. When she came back and handed Gerald his copy of the stamped filing, He handed it to me. I held it carefully, the way you hold something that has weight beyond its paper. The filing formally challenged the fraudulent quitclaim deed and asserted the Callaway Family Trust as the lawful title holder of 14 Birchwood Lane. A hearing date was set for March 18th. Gerald had also sent a letter, certified mail, return receipt requested, to Derek and to Sandra Holt, informing them of the action and advising them to seek legal counsel. He told me that letter would arrive by Wednesday. It arrived Wednesday, and by Thursday morning, Derek called me. I was at Helen's kitchen table with a cup of coffee when my phone rang. I looked at the screen. I let it ring 3 times, and then I answered. Peggy. His voice was different from the charming son-in-law voice, flatter, harder around the edges. What do you think you're doing? Good morning, Derek, I said. You filed some kind of lawsuit. You need to drop it. I took a sip of my coffee. I don't think I'm going to do that. There was a pause. I could hear him breathing. You don't understand the situation, he said. That house. There are things you don't know. We had reasons. Claire agreed to this. Claire did not have the authority to agree, I said, and neither did you. Peggy, I'd like you to speak with my attorney from this point forward, I said. Gerald Fitch, you have his number in the letter. I ended the call. 20 minutes later, Sandra called. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail that was 11 minutes long, which I saved, and later turned over to Gerald. In it, she said, among many other things, that I was a sick old woman who didn't understand what she had signed, that Derek had helped me, that the house had been going to waste, and that if I continued with this ridiculous lawsuit, she would make sure people in Cloverdale knew that I had lost my mind and was a danger to myself. That last part, danger to herself, Gerald flagged as potentially significant. Attempting to use a person's medical history to discredit them in a legal dispute has a name, and it is not a pleasant one. The confrontation, however, did not happen on the phone. It happened on Saturday. I had gone to the house on Birchwood Lane to retrieve several items that had not been in the boxes Sandra left on the porch, specifically Robert's toolbox, which had been in the garage, and several photo albums from the hall closet. Gerald had advised me that I had every right to retrieve my personal belongings, since the fraudulent deed did not transfer ownership of contents, and he had put this in writing. I drove Helen's car. I pulled into the driveway. Sandra came out the front door before I had turned off the engine. She was followed by Derek. I got out of the car slowly. I stood in the driveway of my own home. Above me, the oak tree in the backyard was beginning to show the first gray-green suggestion of buds. You need to leave, Sandra said. She was standing on the porch steps, arms crossed, and her voice had the particular quality of a person who is accustomed to being obeyed. I'm here to collect personal property, I said. My attorney has documented my right to do so. Derek came down the steps. He was taller than Sandra, broad-shouldered, and he stood close in a way that was clearly intended to make me feel small. You're trespassing, he said. I'll call the police. Please do, I said. I'd welcome the opportunity to explain the situation to them. Something moved across his face. A recalculation. He had not expected that. Men who use their size to intimidate rarely expect the person they're intimidating to invite an audience. You don't know what you're getting into, he said, quieter now, which was almost worse. Drop this lawsuit and we can make this easy. Keep pushing and things are going to get very complicated for you. Medical records, competency. There are questions, Peggy. about whether you were really in the right state of mind when you set up that trust. Whether Robert was. I looked at him for a long moment. The oak tree creaked gently. A car passed on Birchwood Lane. "Derek," I said, "you just threatened me in a driveway with no witnesses except your own mother. And you said the word competency out loud to a woman who has a cardiac monitor report, proving she was hospitalized when her signature supposedly appeared on a deed. I want you to think about that." He stared at me. "I'm going to get Robert's toolbox from the garage now," I said. I got the toolbox. I got the photo albums. Sandra stood on the porch and didn't speak again. Derek had gone back inside. I drove back to Helen's, carried the photo albums inside, and sat with them on the guest room bed for a long time, looking at pictures of Robert, pictures of Claire as a small girl, pictures of the house when the Roses were young. Then I slept for 12 hours. I needed 3 days after that. 3 days of Helen's cooking and old movies, and the dog walking the neighbor's retriever in the morning. 3 days of not thinking about the courthouse, not thinking about Derek's face in the driveway, not thinking about Claire. But only 3 days. The offer came through Derek's attorney, a man named Philip Greer, whose letterhead listed 3 cities, and who clearly specialized in making things go away quietly. The letter arrived on the Thursday of my 3rd rest day, forwarded to Helen's address, and Gerald called me as soon as he received his copy. "They're offering a settlement," he said. $30,000, and what they're calling a lifetime right of first refusal if the house is ever sold. I was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean in plain language?" I asked. "It means they keep the house, you get $30,000, and they promise that if they ever sell, they'll ask you before they sell to someone else. It's not legally binding in the way they're implying, and $30,000 is roughly 9% of that property's current market value. $30,000 for the house where Claire took her first steps, for the yard where Robert built a raised garden bed for my tomatoes, for the bedroom where I had slept every night for 31 years, where Robert had died in the gray morning light of a November that still lived in my chest." "No," I said. "I thought so," Gerald said. "I'll draft the refusal." What I want to tell you about that refusal is that it did not feel triumphant. It felt quiet and right and deeply certain. There are moments in life when you know exactly who you are, and that was one of them for me. Derek and Sandra received the refusal within the week, and then something interesting happened. They went quiet. No more phone calls, no more voicemails, no more appearances at the end of Helen's driveway. Because yes, Derek had driven past twice in the second week, which Gerald noted and documented. The sudden silence had the quality of something pulling back before it strikes again, and I was not naive enough to mistake it for retreat. But while they watched me, I found something I had not expected to find. I found my people. It began with Helen, who told a mutual friend named Carolyn about the situation. Not gossip, simply the facts. Because Carolyn was a retired paralegal who had worked in family court for 20 years and was the sort of person whose practical knowledge was worth more than most consultations. Carolyn came to Helen's one Saturday morning with a yellow notepad of her own and a list of questions, and she asked them all steadily, and when she was done, she said, "Peggy, you have an excellent case. Don't you dare settle." Then there was Pastor Dennis from St. Andrew's Lutheran, who had known me and Robert for 20 years, who said nothing preachy but simply showed up one afternoon with a casserole and the information that several members of the congregation had been asking about me and wanted to help. I did not want money, and I told him so, but I said that companionship would not go amiss. So for those days of watching and waiting, I was rarely alone. Carolyn helped me organize my documentation into a binder that Gerald later described as impressively thorough. Helen's neighbor Jim, who was 74 and had been an insurance adjuster, looked at the timeline with me and pointed out 3 small inconsistencies in the notarized deed that I hadn't noticed, and that Gerald had not yet flagged. Did Derek understand, when he drove slowly past Helen's house and looked at the quiet windows, that inside that house, a retired school teacher, a former paralegal, a retired insurance adjuster, and a woman who had loved one house for 31 years were building something careful and complete? I don't think he understood much at all. What I understood was this. The people who had known me and Robert for decades, the people who had helped carry the casket, who had brought food to the funeral, who had called on the anniversary of his death without needing to be reminded, those people were not going to let me be discarded. Not by a man with a wide smile and a forged signature. I was no longer frightened. I was supported. And supported, I was steady. They came on a Tuesday evening, 11 days before the court hearing. I was sitting in Helen's living room with a cup of tea and a library book I wasn't really reading when headlights swept across the front window. Helen, who had an instinct for arrivals, looked up from her crossword and said quietly, "You have company." It was Derek's car. Claire was in the passenger seat. Sandra was in the back. I set down my book. I took a slow breath. Then I went to the door and opened it before they could knock, which I did deliberately, because I wanted them to understand from the first second that I was not going to be startled. "Peggy," Derek said. He was wearing a soft gray sweater, which I recognized as a wardrobe choice. It made him look approachable, thoughtful, safe. We wanted to talk, just as a family, no lawyers. I stepped aside to let them in, because I wanted to hear every word. We sat in Helen's living room, Derek and Claire on the couch, Sandra in the armchair, me on the chair by the window, Helen quietly absenting herself to the kitchen while staying, I noticed, close enough to hear. The lamp made everything look warm and domestic, which was, I was certain, part of what Derek had calculated. He started gently. He told me that things had gotten out of hand. He said Sandra had spoken out of turn on the day I came home from the hospital. He said the transfer of the deed was meant to protect the property from estate complications, and that surely we could find a way through this together, as a family, before the courts got involved and made everything ugly and expensive. Claire said nothing. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the coffee table. I listened to Derek for several minutes without speaking. It is a useful skill, listening without speaking, because people fill silence with information. Then Sandra took her turn. Sandra leaned forward in Helen's armchair and told me, with an expression of great reasonableness, that I was not well, that the cardiac episode had been more serious than I realized, that my confusion about the house was understandable, that Derek had only been trying to help, that the wisest thing, the kindest thing to myself, would be to let it go. She said that continuing the lawsuit would be stressful. That stress was dangerous for someone in my condition. She let that last sentence rest in the room. There it was. Not a threat exactly, more like a door left deliberately ajar. So what is it that you're actually asking me to do? I said. Derek leaned forward, all warm reasonableness. Drop the filing. We don't go to court. We work this out privately. You have access to the house whenever you want. You can keep your garden going, spend holidays there, whatever you need. We take care of the taxes and the maintenance. Everyone wins. I looked at him. Everyone wins, I repeated. Yes. I thought about what everyone wins meant in practical terms. Sandra kept a house she had no legal right to. Derek faced no criminal investigation for forgery. My name on a fraudulent notarized deed remained in the public record. And I became a guest in a home I had owned for 31 years, permitted to tend my roses by the grace of the man who had forged my signature. Derek, I said, I want to ask you something, and I'd like a real answer. He spread his hands open, ready to be generous. Did you think I wouldn't find out about the trust? The open hand stilled. Something crossed his face, fast, almost imperceptible, but I had been watching for it. Because that's the part I keep coming back to, I said. You moved quickly. You had a notary. You filed the deed while I was still in the hospital. You clearly thought about this. And yet you didn't account for the trust. Which makes me wonder, did you know about the trust and think it didn't matter? Or did you simply not look carefully enough? Nobody answered. Sandra's jaw had tightened. It doesn't really matter, I said. Gerald Fitch drew up the Calloway Family Trust, and it's going to be the first thing the judge sees on March 18th. Derek stood up. The warm sweater, the careful posture, the family man performance, all of it dropped away fast, the way a stage set collapses when someone kicks the support. His face went hard and cold. You're making a serious mistake, he said. I've made mistakes before, I said. This isn't one of them. They left. Sandra said something under her breath as she went out the door that I chose not to respond to. Claire paused at the threshold and looked back at me for a long moment. A look I have thought about many times since. And then she went to the car. Helen came out of the kitchen with both hands wrapped around her own cup of tea. I will tell you the truth. After the headlights disappeared down the street, I felt afraid. Not the diffuse, bewildered fear of the first night, but a sharp, specific fear. The fear that Derek might actually do something. That the forgery investigation might drag on. That something unpredictable might happen in the days before the hearing. But I have learned in 68 years that there is a kind of fear that sharpens you. And that evening, sitting in Helen's living room, I let the fear do its work. It made me more certain than I had been all month. The hearing was on a Tuesday morning, and I dressed the way Robert taught me. My navy blue coat. Low heels, not flats, because flats suggest you aren't certain you'll need to stand for long. My hair done properly, not hurried. The binder that Carolyn had helped me organize, carried in my left hand so my right hand was free for handshakes. Gerald met me in the hallway outside courtroom 4 at 8:45. He looked at the binder and nodded just once, which from Gerald Fitch was considerable encouragement. Philip Greer was already inside. He was a broad man in a suit that cost more than my monthly Social Security check, and he sat at the respondent's table with the particular composure of someone who bills by the hour and has therefore made peace with delays. Derek sat beside him in a dark jacket. Sandra sat at the far end, powdered and composed. Claire was not present. Judge Karen Whitfield was in her mid-50s, precise and efficient in the way that family court judges often become after years of watching people mistake courtrooms for theaters. She called the case at 9 o'clock exactly. Gerald began by establishing the foundation. He submitted the original Callaway Family Trust documentation, filed, registered, and recorded in Maddox County in October 2018. He submitted the trust's tax filings for the years since Robert's death, which listed the property at 14 Birchwood Lane as a trust asset. He submitted the property tax records for the same period, all paid by the trust account. He then submitted the quitclaim deed that Derek had filed on January 19th. "Your Honor," Gerald said, "the grantor named on this deed is Margaret R. Callaway, acting as an individual. The Callaway Family Trust has held legal title to this property since 2018. Mrs. Callaway, as an individual, has no title to convey. The deed is therefore void as a matter of law, regardless of any other considerations." Judge Whitfield examined the documents with the attentiveness of someone who has reviewed a great many attempts to move property around and is not impressed by most of them. Philip Greer stood. He had clearly prepared 3 lines of attack, and he deployed the first, that the trust was revocable, and that as the sole trustee, I could act on the property in my individual capacity. Gerald had anticipated this. Carolyn had actually flagged it in her yellow notepad, and his response was precise. A revocable trust still requires the trustee to act as trustee, not as an individual. The deed named me as an individual. It used my personal name and social security number, not the trust's. It had not been executed with the trust documentation required for a property transfer. It was, at every level, incorrectly constructed. Greer's second line, that I had signed the deed voluntarily, and then, having experienced a cognitive episode, failed to remember doing so. Gerald set a single document on the table, my hospital admission record from St. Catherine's Medical Center. Admitted January 9th, discharged January 20th. The deed was signed January 19th at 2:14 in the afternoon. At 2:14 in the afternoon on January 19th, I had been in room 412 of St. Catherine's cardiac unit, attached to a monitor, having been given a mild sedative for an arrhythmia episode at 1:45. The room was quiet. "The signatory," Gerald said, with the even tone of a man who has been waiting to say this for 3 weeks, "was physically incapacitated at the time this document was executed." Greer sat down. His third line, the competency argument, the one Derek had floated in my driveway, he did not even attempt. I suspect Philip Greer, whatever else he was, understood that raising a competency claim against a woman who had arrived with a 3-inch binder and a registered trust and a cardiac monitor printout would not serve his clients well. Judge Whitfield asked Derek 2 questions. First, had he arranged for the notarization of this document? Derek, with Greer's hand briefly on his arm in what I read as a restraining gesture, said that he had facilitated the signing. Second, who had served as notary? There was a pause. Then Derek said the name of a man I didn't recognize. Gerald wrote it down. "The court finds," Judge Whitfield said, in a voice that carried the weight of a woman who had made findings for 20 years, "that the quitclaim deed, filed January 19th by Derek Holt, naming Margaret R. Callaway as grantor, is void and shall be stricken from the public record. Title to the property at 14 Birchwood Lane is vested in the Callaway Family Trust, of which Margaret R. Callaway is the sole trustee." She set down her pen. "Furthermore," she said. This court is referring the matter of the fraudulent notarization to the county prosecutor's office for review. I looked at my hands in my lap. I had not expected the last part. Gerald had hoped for it, but had not promised it. When I looked up, I saw Derek's face, and it was, for the first time since I had known him, entirely unguarded. The calculation was gone. The wide smile was gone. He looked like a man standing in a room he had thought was solid and discovering the floor was not. Sandra stared at the table. I gathered my binder, thanked the judge with a small nod, and walked out of courtroom 4 with Gerald beside me. In the hallway, I stood still for a moment. The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone walked past with a paper cup of coffee. "Peggy," Gerald said quietly. "I know," I said. And I did. The county prosecutor's referral moved faster than I had expected. Gerald told me afterward that forgery of a legal document, combined with an attempted property transfer and the involvement of a notary, was the kind of case that prosecutors find relatively straightforward. Not because it was simple, but because the paper trail was so clear that it almost built itself. Derek was interviewed by an investigator from the prosecutor's office within 2 weeks of the hearing. I was not present for that, of course, and I did not ask Gerald for details he wasn't volunteering. What I knew was this. The notary Derek had named in court, a man named Kevin Birch, who worked for a title company in a neighboring county, had, under questioning, confirmed that he had notarized documents on Derek's instruction and had not witnessed my signature personally. He had, it appeared, made a significant error in judgment in the service of someone who had paid him to make it. That error had a legal name as well. Within 6 weeks of the hearing, Philip Greer sent Gerald a 1-page letter confirming that Sandra Holt would vacate the property at 14 Birchwood Lane by March 31st and would make no further claim to the title. There were no conditions. There was no counteroffer. There was no language about gardens or holidays or everyone winning. It was, by any measure, an unconditional withdrawal. I drove to Birchwood Lane on the morning of April 1st, which I noted with some private humor, given what the date is traditionally associated with. And I stood in the driveway. The silver Buick was gone. The dark sectional sofa was gone, still in the garage, presumably. The glass coffee table was gone. The pot of plastic flowers was gone from the porch. My porch. I unlocked the front door with my key, the original key, which I had never given back because Sandra had changed the locks and I had not been asked. Gerald had arranged for the locksmith to return my locks, which had a slightly formal irony that I appreciated. I stood in the entry hall of my house. The wallpaper that Robert and I had chosen in 1998 was still there. The mark on the door frame where we had measured Claire's height every birthday was still there. The last mark was from when she was 11, because at 12 she said she was too old for it, but we measured her anyway, and she laughed. The oak floors that Robert had refinished himself one summer, on his knees for a week, were still there. I walked through every room. In the kitchen, Sandra had rearranged some of the cabinets and left a set of dishes I didn't recognize on the counter. I boxed them up carefully and set them by the door. In the bedroom, the curtains were mine, but they had been rehung slightly wrong. In the backyard, through the kitchen window, I could see the raised garden bed Robert had built and the roses along the south fence, beginning very slowly to show the first green hints of spring. I sat down at my kitchen table. For a long time, I sat there in the quiet of my own house, in the light that came through my own windows, and I thought about the months just past. I thought about Derek's voice on the phone, "She'll calm down," and about the plastic flowers, and about Carolyn's yellow notepad, and Helen's strong coffee, and Gerald Fitch's small, precise smile. I thought about Robert, who had put a house in a trust in 2018 because he was a careful man who loved me and wanted me to be protected even after he was gone. He had protected me. From 4 years in the future, he had protected me. I want to tell you something about Claire. She called me on the evening of April 2nd. I answered. She was crying before she spoke, the kind of crying that has been held back for a long time and comes out ragged. She said she had known what Derek planned and had told herself it was for practical reasons, family reasons, protection, all the words that scared people use to justify the things they do when they are standing next to someone they shouldn't have trusted. I listened. I did not fill the silence with reassurances she hadn't earned yet. "Mom," she said, "I'm so sorry." "I know," I said. "We talked for a long time that night. I will not share all of it, because some of it is only ours. What I will say is that forgiveness is not a door that opens all at once. It is something you work at in increments, with both hands, over time." Claire and I were at the beginning of that work. As for Derek, he and Claire separated in May. He retained Philip Greer for that as well. The criminal investigation was still ongoing as of the summer. Gerald had advised me not to discuss specifics, and I respected that. But Derek Holt was no longer a man who could walk into a room with a wide smile and count on being trusted, and he knew it. Sandra Holt returned to her own apartment in Trentville, 40 minutes east of Cloverdale, and I understand she did not have a great deal to say about Birchwood Lane to her neighbors there, which I thought was probably wise. On April 15th, I planted the first seeds in the raised garden bed. Tomatoes, as always. Robert's variety, a big, ugly, wonderful heirloom called Mortgage Lifter, which was a name I had always loved and which seemed particularly apt that spring. That summer was one of the better ones I can remember. I had my house back, and I had it differently than before, with the particular appreciation that comes from nearly losing something. I noticed things I had stopped noticing after 30 years. The way the afternoon light crossed the kitchen floor in August, the sound of the oak tree in wind, the smell of the house in the morning before I opened any windows. Having them threatened had taught me to pay attention again. The tomatoes came in well. Mortgage lifters, large and slightly ridiculous, splitting their skins in the August heat. Helen came over twice a week, and we canned tomatoes together, filling the kitchen with steam and vinegar, and the particular satisfaction of putting things by. Carolyn came to dinner most Sundays. Jim from down the street replaced a section of the south fence that had rotted, and I replanted the roses along the new boards. Pastor Dennis officiated at a small garden party I held in late July. Nothing formal, just people who had helped me through the winter and spring, standing in the backyard with cold drinks and plates of food, in the warm evening air. It was not a celebration exactly. It was more like a restoration of something ordinary, which felt like more than celebration. I also updated my estate documents with Gerald, making very clear in the trust language what would happen to the house and when and how. Gerald said it was thorough. I said I had learned from experience. Derek Holt was charged by the county prosecutor in August with forgery of a legal instrument and fraudulent conveyance. He entered a plea agreement in the fall. probation, substantial fines, and a formal civil judgment for legal costs. He did not serve prison time, which I had mixed feelings about. But a criminal record has its own weight, and Derek would carry it. The wide smile would not be enough anymore. His and Claire's divorce was finalized in the autumn. Claire stayed in Cloverdale, found a small apartment not far from Birchwood Lane, and took a new position at the school district office. She came to the garden party in July. She stood near the fence and didn't talk very much, but before she left, she hugged me for a long time in the entryway. We were still at the beginning of the work, but we were working. Sandra Holt had a difficult year. She had lost the house she believed was hers, and with it, whatever story she had been telling her friends in Trentville. Derek's legal troubles were not the kind of thing that stayed private in a county this size. I did not think about her often. When I did, I thought about the plastic flowers on the porch and felt something that was not quite sympathy and not quite satisfaction. Just a clear-eyed understanding that some people make their own winters. My days settled into a rhythm that I recognized as happiness, not because anything was perfect, but because I was where I was supposed to be. I walked in the morning. I read in the evenings. I kept the garden, fed the birds, called Claire on Sundays, had dinner with Helen on Thursdays. One morning in October, I sat on my porch with coffee, watching the oak tree let go of its leaves, and I thought, I almost let them take this from me. Not the house. The house was never really in danger, because Robert had seen to that. What I had almost lost was something harder to name. The will to fight for what was mine. The belief that I had the right to take up the space I had earned. I had not lost it, and that was the thing I was most grateful for. And that is where my story ends, and where the rest of my life, the good rest of it, began. Here is what I learned. People who take from you are counting on one thing: your silence, your willingness to carry your boxes off that porch and never look back. Robert once said that preparation is the most underrated form of love. He was right. What would you have done, standing on those steps that February morning? Leave your answer in the comments. If this story moved you, share it. Someone out there needs to hear it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.